Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. On today's show, we have three exciting pieces of culture to report on. We'll offer you a new perspective on a megastar actress by detailing the lives of 4 generations of Palestinian women in her family. Then we'll ask how far the apple falls from the tree as we speak to the grandson of 2 literary greats, Gabriel García Marquez and Salvador Elizondo, about his debut novel. Unsurprisingly, it's a knockout. And then we'll end by heading to a new exhibition at London's Tate Modern to find out about the work of South African artist Zanele Muholi. Do stay tuned. That's all coming up right here on Monocle on Culture. The actress Hiam Abbass is best known for her turn as Marcia, the sharp, smart wife of Logan Roy in Succession. Well, now she's a star of a much more intimate film, and in the director's chair is her own daughter, Lina Soualem. Bye Tiberias is a documentary which tells the story of her mother's childhood in Palestine and her decision to leave the village in which she grew up to pursue her dreams of becoming an actress in Europe. Now, 30 years after that choice, she returns to the village with her daughter Lina to explore those difficult decisions, the challenges faced by her family in Palestine, and the influence of 4 generations of women on both of their lives. The film is beautiful, both a moving personal family history and a poignant reflection on the current state of the world. I was delighted to hear more about it from Lina, and I began by asking when she first started to hear the stories of her mother's childhood in Palestine.
It's actually difficult to date the moment that I started hearing about these stories, because I always felt they were always present since I was very young. It was always kind of like a background music to my visits to my maternal family and my mother's Palestinian village. But at the same time, it wasn't until I was an adult that I really understood and grasped the experience that they had gone through of displacement, of scattering of the family, of, the losses that they faced and the consequences that exile had on transmission and our relationships. But at the same time, it's kind of contradictory. It's always been present, but it's only when I really started digging these stories while writing the film that I really became conscious of the intensity of what they had gone through.
Yeah, and the way that you've made the film and the way that you present the stories is so interesting, and it makes it so rich. There's historical footage from around the period of the 1940s and the Nakba in 1948, which obviously affected your family's story so profoundly. You also have your mother, who's obviously a very well-known actress, enacting some things. She goes back to the Hawakati Theatre in Jerusalem to enact certain things that happened when she was trying to get married and leave the house for the first time. There's a lot of different things that feed into this. So when did you decide, and how did you decide on the sort of tapestry you were going to weave with this film?
When I started writing the film, I knew that I wanted to include different sources of images, my personal archives that my father was filming in the 90s. I knew that I was going to film the present, but there was different presents because I filmed over a couple of years. So some of the present became the past as well. And I knew that I wanted to include historical archives because it was really important for me to give back to each woman of the family their place and memory and history, because it's actually what they've deprived of. They're deprived of their memory, of their history, as they were displaced from their homeland and their hometowns and could never go back. And when they visit, their memory is completely wiped out of the places. So it was really important for me. And the choice of having so many different layers and timelines and different archives and sources of images, for me, was not an aesthetic choice. It was really a necessity because it's a story that is full of holes and full of ruptures. So it was like recomposing a puzzle. I needed all the pieces so I could tell the story in a linear way. And all the pieces were also all these different sources of images. And in the context of a story that is not recognized as the story of the Nakba and the Palestinian people forced mass displacement in 48, is not written, is not officially recognized. So each image that you find of this time or each story that you record becomes a proof, of a denied existence. So every piece becomes so vital for the story, even if it could appear as a detail, it becomes vital as you are recomposing the puzzle.
You and your mum and her sisters, you reclaim the family tree in a kind of physical way by pasting photographs, old photographs, slightly less old photographs on the wall in the old family apartment in Derhana, which is such a lovely thing. And then, of course, it cuts to your mum and her sisters, your aunts, hanging out on that balcony, which we become so used to by the end of your documentary. That must have been wonderful to sort of transpose those old photographs into these physical people, these real faces and this real flesh and blood, I suppose.
Yeah, there's something that is quite moving, as I said, it's a very fragmented story. So the fact that I could reconnect the past and the present and the faces of the past with those of the present kind of gives a sort of continuity to a story that was actually, full of ruptures. So it was very moving because it makes you feel as you're part of a linear story. It's kind of a utopia because you create an imaginary territory in which everyone coexists and the past and the present coexist as if there was no rupture, when actually the reality is full of ruptures. So it was a way to, it's as if I was trying to answer a question that actually doesn't have an answer. What if we didn't go through forced displacement? What if we all grew up in the same place and lived together, And it was important for me to really allow each person to exist in their full story and be able to play with these timelines as well.
And it's a very intimate film about the relationship, your relationship with your mum and her relationship, obviously, with her family.
Yeah.
You get such amazing reactions from your mother. It's one thing to act lines that someone else has written for you in some very well-known film productions. It's very much another undertaking to do something so intimate and to really look at yourself in the mirror like this. I wonder how you set that up with your mum. I mean, it's moving and it's very beautiful. You two obviously become very close in the making of this film. How did you set those shots up? Because you need to slightly take her by surprise in a way.
Yeah. It's actually, we're always very close, but of course, never really had like an equal relationship in the sense that it was always a mother-daughter relationship. And I had to learn how to address myself to my mother, not as a daughter, but as a director and as a woman. And she had to learn how to address herself to me, not as her daughter, but, as the director or the woman. But at the same time, of course, the daughter as well. So it kind of like enriched the way that we could relate to each other, put us on the same line of equality. And at the same time, I was understanding that it was hard for her to share elements of her private experience, because as a fiction actress, she's not used to speak about herself and her path. She's used to speak about the emotions that she lends to, other characters, and she always puts herself in other people's shoes and stories. So I've had to find ways also to try to get to her core emotions without being in a confrontation and without always being in a set of like questions and answers. And so for me, asking her to reenact moments of her youth was a way to do that, because I knew that what she liked most was to act. And while she was acting, she wasn't really acting, because it was asking her to reminisce a moment of her real life, of her youth, with one of her sisters that was present at the time in a place where she actually had lived this moment. So it was kind of like trying to bring her back to the emotion that she had felt at this time. And that way it was really moving to see how it allowed her to share things with me that she couldn't really share if I had just asked her directly,
Yeah. No, it's very successful, and we feel very privileged to have that access and for these stories to be told so freshly, I suppose, and unadulterated in the film. And it's also inevitably, Lina, it's a film about geography and about the maddening state of borders. And your mother, more than once in the film, sort of sits at dusk on that balcony and is talking to you about, Damascus is this way, and Lebanon is this way, and she's talking about all the points of the compass, and there are parts of her family which have been spread against their will largely amongst those borders, throughout those borders. Did it help to put together a bit of a jigsaw puzzle for you for making this film about one side of your family and about the sort of the politics of that region and how they've always been so complex?
I mean, for me, it was clear since the beginning that the film was not going to be only about, personal memories, because I knew that all these intimate memories were contributing to a collective memory. And I also was very conscious of the fact that the political context was affecting, the most intimate relationships and the paths and the most intimate paths. But at the same time, I really wanted to focus on the individual, on the women, on their feelings and how they lived these events and their, and their most intimate feelings, I would say. And because for me, it was a way to give them back a place in the foreground and allow them to not be always defined by the context, by the background, because it's also a way of dehumanizing, when you only speak about Palestinians as a mass, as numbers, you only speak about their experiences in from a collective point of view. And it's contributing to dehumanizing, because this is what we're witness of today. They are so dehumanized that people are still finding ways to justify what is happening, and especially killing of children, And so for me, it was really important to focus on the humanity and the strength of these women that, despite exile, despite forced displacement, despite the scattering and heartbreaks of having to separate with members of their families, they've been able to not only maintain their history and their legacy alive, but also to transmit it. And they've been able to, achieve some of their dreams and aspirations. They've been able to influence the people around them, to transmit values of love and forgiveness to their children. And this is what, for me, resistance is. It's the daily survival, and not only survival, living and continuing to celebrate your culture and the richness of your culture and your values, despite chaos around you.
That was the filmmaker Lina Soualem discussing her new film, Bye Tiberias. And the film is released to selected cinemas in the UK on the 28th of June. Now, if anyone can be said to have strong literary bones, it's surely the Mexican writer Mateo García Elizondo. He's the grandson of both the renowned Colombian novelist Gabriel García Márquez and the Mexican writer Salvador Elizondo. Mateo himself has been described as one of the most prominent young writers in the Spanish language. His debut novel, Last Date in El Zapotal, tells the story of a man who rents a grimy room in a backwater town as he prepares to die, a junkie with a final wish for one last fix. Despite its heavy premise, the novel performs a delicate dance along the boundary between the living and the dead, between darkness and light, and humour and abject misery. It's a triumph of a book, and one that proves that García Elizondo deserves acclaim far apart from his impressive literary family tree. Monocle on Culture producer Sophie spoke to Mateo and began by asking how the character came to him.
I had been thinking about writing about a junkie for a while because some of my friends had been ex-junkies and they told me a lot of stories, and I was very interested in telling those stories. And I don't know, one day the character's voice just popped into my head and started telling me the story. I was coming out of a theater and I took a taxi and I started hearing his voice and the beginning especially of the novel. And I really connected with that voice. I found him really like endearing and funny at times, even though, as you say, the subject matter was pretty dark. The character's voice was like really funny and endearing to me. And so practically the entire novel is just me listening to this guy tell his story. And that's kind of how he was born. I was very clear on the fact that it was this junkie who didn't have any problems with being a junkie, who embraced it, and who also embraced dying, which was his mission for the novel. And that kind of carried me through the entire thing.
Yeah, as you mentioned, he's on a mission to die. That's his plan. You find that out right at the beginning, and the whole book is sort of him kind of working out when and where to do that. And you mentioned there that it is quite funny. And I wanted to ask you about the humour. Did you always see those two things balancing out? And did you always want to inject a lot of humour into the novel alongside these very kind of heavy themes and the sense of death that pervades the whole thing?
Well, I don't know if it was my original plan, but it was the way it turned out. I mean, I had this weird idea about this character really not being scared of dying and really embracing death. And that point of view really made it funny at times, because usually people are very scared of death and we are very resistant to death. And this character, it was an opportunity to change that point of view, and that point of view almost, I don't know why, but it made it funny because it was a different way of looking at life, sort of a more detached way of looking at life. And I think if you look at life from the outside, often it's very funny in a dark way, or it's dark in a funny way. I don't know how to explain it. And I laughed all the way through with this guy who was suffering a lot and trying to die, but I laughed a lot, and I hope the readers will too.
Yeah, I definitely laughed much more than I thought I would. The idea of reality feels quite blurry quite often, and I wonder how you approached creating that tone and that kind of limbo space that the main character seems to occupy the whole way through.
Well, I've always been very interested in altered states of consciousness in general, and before writing this novel, I wrote a lot of screenplays for movies. And screenplays are funny because you're always telling the story from the outside, from the point of view of a camera, and you don't often get to go into the thoughts of a character. I mean, not as much as you can do so in fiction. And so for me, this was an opportunity to really get into the mind of a character, and not only that, but also of a character who was constantly stoned on the one hand, and then really close to dying on the other hand. So it gave me a chance to explore this theme that I'm really interested in, which is like liminal spaces of consciousness, you know, the place where reality meets dreaming, and life meets death, and hallucination meets reality. I don't know, there's like this sort of point where the real and the unreal meet. And for me, this was the perfect character and the perfect situation, this junkie about to die, to explore that kind of dreamy, hallucinatory state. But I was also telling a story that was happening in real life, so I got a lot of chance to play with that, with hallucination, with dreaming. The character is really in a bardo, is what I kind of discovered in the process of writing the novel, is that he is halfway. He is in that sort of transitional state between life and death, or between being awake and being asleep. And I found that very interesting, and it's a story that you can only tell if you're inside a character's mind, and that's one of the things that most amused me, let's say, about writing this novel.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was how that state becomes quite expansive. And he says at one point that he thinks of himself as almost a saint. He's this kind of visionary. He's actually kind of learning and finding out a lot within that state. I wanted to ask you about this novel as a love story. The main character has two loves, I guess. He's got two ladies. One that is more... Metaphor. One is in the form of a kind of, yeah, exactly. And I wondered how you thought of it as a love story.
Like the first impression is that this is a novel about death and heroin. And I always say that it's more a story about desire a lot. And yeah, it's a lot about desire and the fact that he is dying and that he's facing death constantly is actually an opportunity to really reflect on life and what's really important about life, I think. And I think the takeaway from what I learned by writing this novel is that the really important things are is all about love and about friendship and the things that you remember before you die. And most of the regrets, I think, of the dying have to do with love and with missed opportunities in friendship and in love. And so, the character is obsessed with taking heroin and it's his lady in a sense. But there's also that love story, and I think love and death are really very closely intertwined. So for me, the love story really came very organically. And it was a very important part of making this character that was really detached from life also be really fond of life and really nostalgic about life. So I think that's what, in the end, love and desire is what keeps you holding on to life.
That was the writer Mateo García Elizondo there, and Last Date in El Zapotal is published on the 25th of June. Finally on today's show, Zanele Muholi's breakthrough came more than 20 years ago with a series of portraits documenting the experiences of South Africa's LGBT community immediately after the end of apartheid. This iconic photographer, visual activist and now sculptor is the subject of a survey exhibition that's brought together their body of work at London's Tate Modern. As we'll hear, Muholi's practice continues to be revolutionary and has forever changed how sitters are treated by their photographers and how they're viewed by audiences. Monocle's George Ruskin was at the opening of the exhibition and sent us this story.
This is a mid-career survey exhibition that feels like it has arrived at the perfect time for Zanele Muholi. The visual activist rose to prominence in the early 2000s with photographs that told stories from the black queer community in South Africa. These coincided with the major social and political changes in the country. Muholi's photography documents a community emerging from the shadows of apartheid and beginning to claim its space in a new South Africa. A country that on the one hand was the first place in the world to constitutionally outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation, but where homophobic attacks still occur all too frequently. Their work therefore juxtaposes hope and trauma, treating each individual subject as a collaborator who meets the viewer's gaze in every portrait. Returning to London after a run cut short by world events in 2020, this exhibition opens on the back of a record-breaking European tour, as Muholi emerges as a dominant figure in art and activism. At the exhibition's opening, I caught up with its curator Amrita Dalu, Tate Modern's Assistant Director of International Art. I began by asking her about the themes that have defined Muholi's career so far.
Muholi is an artist but also a visual activist, which means that the exhibition itself is slightly different from a usual photographic monograph because a lot of people in their community take center stage. The sitters in the portraits are looking directly at you. They have agency. They all have their own personalities. They're dressed to the nines. They're empowered. Like, it's really indicative of the way that Muholi works with the people in the portraits, because for Muholi, they're not subjects, They're definitely not objects, but they're participants. They're people with stories to tell, and that's the purpose of Muholi's photographs. And also what's so beautiful about it is that you can see that Muholi has a really deep and profound connection with every one of the sitters.
This is equally revolutionary for Muholi's audience. Moving through the exhibition, each sitter meets your gaze and challenges you to hold it. This is reinforced in the gallery by a soundscape produced by one of Muholi's closest collaborators, the sound artist and musician Toya DeLazy, who has created unique sonic responses to each section of the show. I was interested to learn about the curatorial challenges and opportunities that Muholi's holistic approach presented to the team at the Tate Modern.
So there's a really important room in the show called Faces and Phases, and this is a central series of Muholi's work, and it's a living archive. So it's over 600 works long, and it documents the faces and phases of people at different stages of their life, marked by different moments in their life, whether that's transition marked by gender transition, marriage, job transition, also death. But what's amazing about it is that it's living, it's ongoing, and also that's reflective in the way that we hang the works. So there are also gaps in between the portraits to indicate people who have passed, but also people who are yet to be added to the archive. We're also dealing with themes of sexual violence and things like corrective rape and all those kinds of things that are associated with people being not able to be their true selves in society. However, we're really also moved by the fact that that's not all that Muholi is, I guess, motivated to depict in their photographs, because the whole point of Muholi's work is to show you that every single individual has autonomy, is empowered, and has a life to live, and has lived a beautiful life up until this point. So we're all trying to balance, I guess, the journey that the viewer goes through by making sure that each room, has all of those dynamics all encompassing in the space. And I think that's really the experience you have when you go through the show.
Other key series of work in the exhibition include Brave Beauties, a celebration of non-binary people and trans women, including my favourite of Muholi's works, the winner of the National Trans Beauty Pageant, photographed in a formerly segregated beach in Durban. Another series, simply called Being, documents queer couples, placing them in mise-en-scène that challenge the heteronormative white supremacy that they continue to live under. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, is the series of self-portraits named after the isiZulu name meaning Hail the Dark Lioness. Muholi turns the camera on themselves in dramatic self-portraits that repurpose objects like tyres, cable ties and scouring pads into politically loaded props. Highlights like these put a single question in every viewer's mind. Where will Muholi go next? I couldn't resist the opportunity to hear Amrita's predictions as someone who has worked so closely with them.
I mean, Muholi's a star and has been for so long, so it's only just going to get bigger and more exciting. The platform's only going to get bigger. I feel like there's just going to be loads more big survey shows to come, but also I see Muholi dipping and expanding their work into loads more mediums. So, for example, in the show, in one of the incredible rooms that spotlights the Sonyama Gonyama series, there are 2 bronze sculptures in there that sort of expand on that particular series. So they're self-portraits, and it's Muholi dabbling into the practice of making bronze sculptures. So not just sculptures, but bronze sculptures. And as you know, there is a history of making bronze sculptures, and it's a particularly European material history. So also, not only is Muholi, subverting the principles of photography, but now they're doing it in any material that they are moved by, which is really exciting, because those sculptures were initially displayed in the Jardin des Tuileries. So they were coming up against and facing off Rodin sculptures and things like that. And they were creating monuments to rest, monuments to empowerment. And I just feel that I see them doing more sculptures, but also dipping into more historic material practices and subverting them in the way that they've done with their photography. So I'm interested to see where it's going to go next.
That was Amrita Dalu, curator of the Zanele Muholi exhibition at Tate Modern, in conversation with Monocle's George Ruskin. And that is it for this week. My thanks to all our contributors and interviewees. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. Many thanks to Lily Austin and Flynn Simons for their help editing this episode. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bounds, thanks for tuning in.